So welcome to my webinar. Go ahead and introduce yourself if you wouldn't mind, Rob, and
Sure.
Go ahead and maybe just say a little bit about what you do.
Sure. My name is Rob Case, and I am a surfing paddling technique coach. I basically teach surfers of all levels around the world how to paddle with less effort, how to paddle faster, and how to paddle um, without injuring their shoulders or their necks. And I run a level 1 course that focuses on those 3 goals, and then a level 2 course that focuses on the sprint technique as well as catching the wave. And then I do a couple other programs as well, but that's the main thing that I do.
Awesome. How did you get into actually working with surfers just on paddling techniques specifically?
That's a good question. It's actually by accident, like
But that's
many
fine.
wonderful things. Yeah. I was actually releasing a surfing fitness program that was focused in the pool that I did, and people wanted me to share it, and so I released that. And someone had convinced me, hey, why don't you put out some marketing videos? And I thought, well, what would be helpful? Well, I've been studying paddling technique for a long time, but it's been under the radar because amongst my friends, saying that you weren't tired at the end of a session wasn't socially
Right.
acceptable. It
I
was
get
like,
that.
oh, well, you didn't surf hard enough. I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure I caught just as many waves as you, and now I'm not tired at all. So
Right.
I never thought people wanted to hear about the research that I've been learning about. And so I put out this video on YouTube explaining a couple techniques, and
I
it
got
blew
that
up.
like
Yeah.
2 years ago.
And
It was a while ago.
yeah,
Yep.
it was a while back, and people still comment on how amazing it is. So I took basically my research and structured it into a format that was teachable and repeatable. So that's
Yeah,
kind of
did
how I got into it, and I haven't been looking back.
your friends want to know now why you're not tired at the end of the you come out of the
I've had a
classes
few of
about that?
them. Yeah, I've had a few of them take my workshop, and one of them specifically said, "Oh man, I'm kind of angry at you now." And I'm like, "Why?" He's like, "Well, 'cause I used to use surfing as a workout, and now I'm not tired anymore." I'm like, "Oh, sorry, man. Welcome to the club."
Incredible. And you mentioned too, one of the goals of the first courses was to prevent neck and shoulder injury. And so what have you seen, like, what were you seeing? And then how is your program kind of solving that right now? Like what are you kind of seeing the result of with that? That's awesome.
There's a there are a lot of different techniques that surfers have adopted naturally that through swim studies have already proven a lot of shoulder issues just from that same motion. We're actually a little bit different body mechanics than a swimmer, and so that's what I've been transitioning over the last 20 years. What do we take from swimming research and apply it? And then there's definitely some things that I've noticed that a surfer has created that they think is efficient, but is actually causing them harm. So a lot of times when we learn on our own, we learn through feel. And if we're an adult and we're learning this, we could learn like that pressure on our hand, that pressure on our forearm, and think, oh, that's a really, really good sensation. And I feel like I'm going fast when I do that. But if you're pushing in the wrong direction and your arm is at a certain angle that is susceptible for injury for your rotator cuff, it could be making it even worse.
Yeah.
So that's what I found. A lot of surfers, the biggest mistakes is they understand the basic principle that you have to push harder to go faster. But what they don't get is that you can overpower water, for one. And then what they don't get also is the direction in which they're supposed to apply that force. And those two things really combined with another law of motion basically explains my whole program. So that's what I'll share with you guys today.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think for me, when I sat in a little bit on that one weekend workshop, I think probably the 2 most powerful things I walked away with just sitting in on a little bit was just thinking about that internal rotation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you even talked, what did you call it? The San Clemente paddle.
Yeah, the really high, the proud paddle.
Proud
Yeah, that's
paddle.
another one.
And
Yeah.
then this week in the course, I'm talking a lot about posture, and we're talking about upper and lower cross syndromes, which I think most Americans probably have some attributes of almost anybody who sits in front of a computer.
Yeah.
And so while I'm not covering it as much in this course, that concept that if you're rounded here, you're weak here,
Yeah.
you're tight in your thoracic spine, that's going to affect your paddling because you don't have that thoracic extension and mobility to like help manage, the level of your board. And that was something I walked away with just thinking about, you want that board more flat than you really think you want it. And I mean, we've all seen the like dangling off the back of the board with the legs wide open. I mean, that's the extreme, but having that thoracic mobility to help paddle.
It just gives you more options. It gives you more of an ability to keep yourself flat in all situations, or keep, basically my terminology, keep your horizontal balance steady and controlled, as well as your lateral balance controlled. So you don't need to be the most flexible, the most mobile person in the world when you're thoracic spine, but having more mobility, having more endurance and flexibility helps with your ability to save the board from going under, or to maintain it at the surface of the water for a longer period of time. So it's not the end of the world. You want some minimal mobility for sure, and minimal endurance. But yeah, it's not the end of the world if you don't. It's funny when you said posture, I stood up. I was like,
what are you talking about? I'm not slumped over. Oh my gosh.
No, I'm standing actually. I have a standing workstation right now, and I have a sitting over here. So yeah, when I talk, I like to move around anyway, so this works.
I'm like it's like the shoemaker's children wearing barefoot. I'll catch myself, and even writing this week's chapter about the posture, I was like, oh yeah. But,
you're like,
what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Anyway, well, why don't I do this, Rob? I'm going to turn this over to you, and you can kind of get going on this. So I think I'm going to just make you a host, and you should have. And it should be good to go. So you're driving the boat.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here, and then I'll ask if you guys can see it. So it should be a presentation in my etched surfboard here.
Very nice.
So I'm going to go through kind of the high level introduction to level 1, talk a little bit about a few things that the listeners can take away. So I think a lot of people that are coming and talking about paddling, they already know what the big deal about it is, but I like to kind of explain it a little bit more using some hard evidence. So there was a study done a while back on competitive surfers showing that approximately 85% of the active time was paddling. Now this is in a contest at a point break. So for the rest of us, it's probably more like 95% of the active time is us paddling, and probably 99% if you're up here in San Francisco at Ocean Beach. So it's a majority of the activity of us moving around versus wave riding. And so that right off the bat, if we can improve just a little bit of it, even a negligible amount, we're going to improve our whole session. The other thing is, if you're only surfing a few times a week, you're more susceptible to injury. And Shane, you can probably confirm this, that when you have lack of activity, when you have lack of movement, it's kind of like a motor that freezes up in your garage, and it basically freezes up, and you're not able to move those parts again. So the more that you use that motor, that engine, it's going to break down every once in a while, but you don't want it to break down and freeze up completely from lack of activity. So when you have lack of activity, you often have more susceptibility to injury. Especially if you're using incorrect technique, because you're amped, you're excited, you're frothing, and then you go out there and you hurt yourself. Yeah. And now you're out for another few weeks. And then you can also get exhausted from it as well. Without paddling, you can't really catch waves. That's not necessarily true. It's difficulty catching waves, but I have many examples where you don't even have to paddle and you can catch a wave. That's what we really talk about in our level 2, is how do you position yourself optimally how do you time your sprint, and if you need the sprint, the effective sprint technique. But you will have difficulty catching waves if you can't paddle. Yeah, when you feel like you're not going anywhere and you're paddling against currents. And then the big one is injured shoulders is the big one. This was a study that was done a few years back, where the average time to recovery was 4 or more months, and the average cost was around $6,000 for the rotator cuff.
I mean,
pretty amazing. Like that's pretty high, and it puts you out. And more important to a surfer is that takes you out of your surf for that long, so you don't even get to surf during that time period. So there's a lot of issues. We want to focus on paddling. It really should be called paddling rather than surfing, because we're not actually surfing most of the time. Kind of like how fishing is not called catching. That wouldn't be as nice and marketable. So there are these 3 goals that we're trying to achieve. First and foremost, we want to try to use less energy. If we can use less energy, we can catch more waves, we can stay out longer, we can have more opportunity to improve our surfing. We definitely want to learn how to move faster, how we can generate more speed, and so that we can catch faster moving waves when we need to. So our primary goal is actually using less energy in general, and only using and expending extra energy when we need that extra speed. And then how do we do this all injury-free as much as we can? So our level 1, like I said, these are our 3 goals in level 1, and that builds the foundation for everything after that. So I teach everything up through the pop-up, and then I hand it off to more experienced surf coaches to teach you how to turn and all that. But essentially, if you don't have this, then you can't even set up catching the wave appropriately, and then if you can't catch the wave, you can't pop up, and it's all built upon one after the other. So I've had the opportunity of working with some higher level surfers that surf on the WQS and above, and they've even said, just having an extra split second to get into the wave sooner, or that extra second of clarity before they take off, could be the difference between an extra turn and a heat or not, and that could be everything to them. For the recreational surfer, it could be one extra wave that made your day, right? So these are our 3 goals that we're going after, and there's actually a really simplified way to achieve that. The first thing we want to actually do is reduce any resistance in the water, and then add propulsion. I think, Shane, you asked about some mistakes that surfers kind of make, and I think every surfer thinks in their mindset, if I just get stronger and more fit, I'm going to paddle better. And there's definitely truth to that. But it's kind of like I can be the Incredible Hulk and have all this propulsion, all this strength, and even endurance. But if I'm dragging 15 parachutes behind me, it's just easier to cut the parachutes first, and then add the propulsion on top of that. And a lot of times when we're focused on fitness and we're focused on just strength and endurance, we're not thinking about how we use that fitness. So this is from beginner all the way up to the pros, all the way up to the pro training level. They're still thinking fitness as the first step. I have no problem with fitness being involved in that, but technique is really the fastest way to improve your paddling, and then you add the fitness on top of that, and everything gets amplified past that. Right. So this is our general formula. When we in my level 1 course, it's like a checklist. So when you're feeling tired, when you're feeling slow, when you're feeling like you're hurting yourself, you walk through this checklist, and it always starts with, am I reducing resistance first? And then am I applying effective propulsion after that? And that usually will answer your question, so you can self-diagnose yourself out in the water. Pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
When you have this, you get more speed, you get way more efficiency, and you prevent injury. So that's our general formula. I'm a math guy, so I'm going to throw out a bunch of formulas and math, but I'll try to keep it simple. So all of these things are actually based on the 3 laws of motion. I'm going to really quickly go through this because, like I said before, this is kind of the basis of of the entire level 1 and level 2 programs. And really it's the basis of us moving through water. So real quickly, I won't go deep into this, but essentially the first law is the law of inertia, and this is the one that we want to tap into as much as we can. So think of like this seal here. When it takes a stroke, it just glides. And it doesn't need to take another stroke for a very long time unless it really needs to pick up its speed. It's tapping into the law of inertia. He's nice and streamlined from nose all the way to tail, and he takes that one stroke and he pulls those flippers right in close to his body. So that's like what we want to do. When we take a stroke, we want to go as far as we can. We want a high distance per stroke. So the law of inertia states that an object's going to go in motion until something gets in its way or a force acts upon it to slow it down or change direction. So here on Earth, we've got gravity, we've got air resistance, and in water, we've got water resistance. So the gravity we can't do anything about. Air's not going to affect us unless we're knee paddling or we're sup paddling. So if we're prone, air resistance doesn't make that big of an impact, even on a really windy day. But water resistance is the one that we really need to make sure that we think about and we reduce as much as we can. The next law of motion is the law of net forces. And if you ignore all this stuff and you just look at this formula here, what you notice is that force is equal to mass times acceleration. So if mass stays the same, then what we're going to do is we're going to take this A and we say, all right, as a surfer, I want to accelerate more, right? So therefore, I just need to use more force. Now, every surfer gets this. Every surfer understands this. But what a lot of surfers, I'd say 99% of surfers, don't understand is that you can overpower water, and it's going to reduce your acceleration.
Yeah, so can you explain that a little bit? Like, how do you overpower water?
So kind of like if, well, let's take an example where you can't overpower. You can't overpower like the concrete that you're standing on, right? You can't press down and it break, right? And push through it. But you can overpower something like mud that's a little bit, it's thicker than water, but if you press down through it, it's going to go down through it. And then water is a liquid, and so you can actually overpower it completely. And then air, we absolutely overpower it in every sense. Yeah. So with water, in order for us to move forward, it's not as light as air, right? So with air, I can push like this, but I'm not moving this direction when I push, right? I'm completely overpowering it. I can't fly, in other words. When I push against the wall, I'll move back, right? And water's kind of in between. So with water, that same drag that slows us down, we actually use that to move forward.
Yeah.
And so if we push too hard, it's kind of like you're in your car and you're spinning the wheels, but you're not going anywhere. So you're using a ton of energy, but you're not really going anywhere until friction takes place and you take off. Same kind of concept with water. It's not necessarily friction that makes us move forward, but it's that same drag that slows us down. We can actually grab hold of that and move forward. So a lot of surfers, they think, oh man, when I can hear the water, when I can hear my stroke, that's a good thing. I must be paddling really hard. And in fact, it's the opposite. You're very inefficient at that point. You're using more energy than the return on that investment is giving you. So that's one kind of auditory cue you can track yourself with while you're paddling around. If you start to hear your stroke, if you start to hear air bubbles and water moving, that's too much. You're doing too much. Slow everything down. You want to be more like a paddling ninja. Be super quiet and move through the water. The kind of other side of this that surfers mistake is that they might overpower it, but and it relates to this third law of motion, they're actually applying a lot of the force, majority of the force, in the wrong direction. So what this is saying is that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if we want to move forward, we should apply that same force in the second law of motion backwards at all times. Mm-hmm. But a majority of surfers, through feel, through kind of trying to learn it on their own, majority of their force actually happens in the front part of their stroke when they're pushing down. And down sends you up. So if you're the surfer that you see the nose pop up every stroke, it pops up every stroke, pops up every stroke, your first motion is down instead of back. And you don't get to pushing back until probably halfway or almost more than halfway through your stroke. So you are moving forward, but it's at a very inefficient way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Yeah, so those three laws of motion, those are the things that we want to keep in the back of our head when we're out paddling and when we're reviewing a lot of these techniques. We want to tap into inertia first. That's our number one efficiency. Not necessarily for speed, but for efficiency of movement and energy. We want to spend a long time out in the ocean. We don't want to use a lot of energy. We want to tap into inertia. We don't want to overpower water. We want to get up to that point where we're moving effectively. We want to apply force to accelerate, but we don't want to overdo it. So we want to be like a ninja when we paddle. And we want to make sure that any force we do apply is actually in the backwards direction. We don't want it going up. We don't want it going down. We only want it going backwards. And that's the most effective propulsion we're going to get. So that's kind of the gist of those three laws of motion. And through that, you get a lot greater gains through reducing drag than you would propulsion. This goes back to, should I bulk up and get really strong, or should I get more streamlined? You actually get greater gains through reducing resistance in water. Why? Right? Well, water is about 800 to 1,000 times more dense than air, depending on what the salinity of the water or fresh water. And so if you think about this, and I apologize for this wonderful art that you're seeing.
I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I was actually going to say that was one of the things I remember the first video I ever saw. Your stick figures were awesome.
My stick figure drawings, they're quite on a diet. So but if you think of the water as these little molecules, right? So they slow us down significantly. But like I said earlier, we use those same molecules to move through the water. So we push them back to move us forward. But we've got all these other molecules in front of us. So if we can imagine our body and our board as like a dart or a torpedo, when we apply force, that torpedo is going to go a lot faster than if I present it with this wide barge and I'm laid out and I don't care about drag whatsoever. Then this is going to slow down that stroke a lot faster. And so unfortunately, what happens every time we take a stroke, we get this acceleration. And then if we don't take another stroke right off the bat, we have deceleration because the water slows us down. Pretty simple. So what we would like to do is we want to draw out that velocity like the seal and have that inertia. So when we take a stroke, it doesn't decelerate immediately. You have that movement, that velocity, and then it slowly decreases before another piece of propulsion drives you forward. So you have one after the other after the other. And when you can do that, it's kind of like in a car. If you're driving on the highway, you have really high fuel efficiency. There's not a lot of stop and go. But in the city, there's a lot of stop and go, and so it's not as efficient. Same kind of deal. Once you're moving, once you have momentum, you can continue that efficiency by tapping into that law of inertia every time and staying nice and streamlined. And that way you don't have that stop and go and that deceleration all over the place. That's why it always feels easier once you're underway paddling, but those first few strokes are a lot harder. Yeah. So another thing on kind of propulsion in that same concept is the application of force. So we only have two arms. So we don't have, like this propeller has three sources of propulsion. Four-bladed propeller has four. And so the benefit of having more blades is so that that propulsion doesn't reduce too much before the next one takes over. Next one takes over, next one takes over. So because we only have two arms, we can't have something like this where you have propulsion right after the next, after the next. This goes down significantly before the next one comes around because our arms have to come all the way around. And so what we want to do in between those strokes is we really want to emphasize this glide, this reduce, this be like more like the seal and glide until the next one comes around and takes it over. And again, this is just talking about efficiency. When we reduce drag, that's how we can increase efficiency and ultimately on the other end, start to increase speed. When we look at the America's Cup boats, why did they go from monohull to trimaran, and then to a catamaran, and then to foils? And now this year they're coming out with a monohull on a foil. It's crazy.
That is crazy.
They're getting rid of drag,
Yeah.
right? Because they can't blow the wind any harder. They can't add propulsion any harder. So how do they get faster? They get rid of drag. And so there's numerous examples in nature and such as well. So that leads us to the discussion around drag and why it's important. I'm not going to go into great detail into this, but I think you get the general gist that there are many different types of drag, and essentially what we want to do is we want to reduce any form of drag that we're experiencing. And the easiest way to reduce drag is through a tapered surface. So right here, this is an untapered surface. So this is kind of a close-up view of what I mean by a tapered surface. When you have a tapered surface, you have low resistance in the beginning, and it works its way around, and it's not that strong in the back end. So this is kind of like the shape of our body from the top, for example. It could also be a cross-section of, say, our finger, right? Our finger comes in and it breaks that frontal drag, and it easily moves around it. But if we provide a really blunt surface, let's say we paddle with a fist instead, and we hit that water, well, there's going to be a lot of resistance right off the bat, and there's a lot of resistance in the back end. It's called eddy drag back here. So in short, the best way to reduce drag is to present yourself in a tapered or torpedo fashion and use any tools that you have at your disposal in order to reduce that drag.
That Bernoulli's principle? Is that what that is? No.
It's not quite related to that. Bernoulli's talks about lift, and this is
Way
more
off.
reduction of drag. Yeah,
Got it.
yeah,
Physics was a while ago.
yeah. Then we can work on propulsion. So once you reduce all that drag, then you can work on propulsion. And like I said, fitness is a fundamental kind of under the iceberg kind of thing that we always want to have strength, flexibility, endurance, agility, balance as our foundation. But I had a guy the other day who just had kids, and he's like, man, I can't do anything anymore. I was like, well, this is going to really help you, because even if you're not doing anything, you can go out there and you can have a good surf. You might not be as fast, you might not last as long, but you sure as heck won't injure yourself, and you're at least getting out there and saving energy versus gassing yourself out after 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So having fitness certainly just amplifies everything that we've been talking about, which is great.